Sergers, nothing but Sergers timing. Sergers can drive you berserkers. For all you workers or YouTube lurkers, grab a glass of wine so we can change the Sergers time tonight.
Well, welcome to the best Serger retiming video on the internet, mainly because it's the only Serger retiming video on the internet. I haven't found a single video anywhere that actually goes through all the adjustments. I'm just some guy. I'm not actually a tech or anything, but I've just gleaned this stuff from reading a bunch of service manuals and just kind of trial and error over and over and over again for weeks, months even. You should be pretty careful if you're going to retime your Serger. You could really mess it up. On the other hand, I've never messed up any of the Sergers I've retimed, but make sure it's the timing, right? There's a lot of problems you could have with a Serger that are not the timing that would affect the stitch quality. The best way to make sure that it is, in fact, a timing issue is to just hand crank the machine while threaded and really slowly and closely watch all of the interactions between the two loopers and the needles. So here's a Serger I recently retimed to as best as I could spec, since I actually have the service manual I found online. This thing is what I'm going to use to illustrate perfect timing, or something very close to it. The needle threads look perfect. The white upper looper thread looks great. The convergence between the upper looper and lower looper thread looks great. And the lower looper thread looks great. That's what a perfect 4-thread serge looks like. That said, I never see close-ups of what good timing looks like anywhere. Illustrations in a service manual, but no close-ups. So I made some close-ups. The key here is that the needles are not hitting the upper looper, and they are coming down in between the upper looper and the upper looper thread, which is white in this case. The upper looper has a furthest leftmost position. Too far left and the needles will hit it and break. Too far right and the left needle in particular will just not be able to grab the upper looper thread. Here's the lower looper, upper looper timing. This is the timing where if you get it wrong, it could damage the machine. The needles are substantially weaker than the upper looper or the lower looper, but if the two loopers themselves hit each other, probably some stuff is going to get bent. This is the view most people are probably familiar with if they're watching a Serger, because this is what you actually see when you're serging. You're watching the upper looper grab the lower looper thread from the front. The upper looper sits in the socket and it can rotate around in the socket. If it rotates too far one way, it'll end up hitting the lower looper, too far the other way, and it'll hit the needles. So the lower looper is grabbing the needle threads. The needle threads are taut until the needle pulls up, then they loop. And right when they loop, the lower looper grabs them. They're partially looping because needles have a feature called a scarf that helps the lower looper grab in between the thread and the needle, and they're partially looping because when the needles pull back and they have thread in them, they loop. You're going to need tools. So here's this Serger I'm going to be retiming. It's a popular Serger, albeit somewhat old. The tools you need to retime this thing aren't really that expensive. You need sewing machine oil, some compressed air would be nice. Digital calipers if you want to spend 15 or 20 bucks to make the needle bar height adjustment more exact. Your typical things like a screwdriver, some flatheads, small millimeter metric Allen bars, couple of sockets, your typical serger threading stuff, feeler gauges, quite useful. A millimeter metal ruler, almost essential. A variety of pliers and so on, Sharpies, coins, super glue if you're so inclined, new needles. You're going to have to time the machine with new needles, and maybe some metal brushes in case you're in the mood to clean stuff. It's not that expensive. You could probably not even use most of that and still be able to time the serger. And here's a telescoping magnet I picked up for $1. That is quite useful. So this is just me taking off all the plastic parts. Realistically, if you're going to retime the serger, you probably can figure out how to take all the plastic parts off. So I'm not going to go into this. Suffice to say, if you're unsure of whether you should take something off or not, or about the order, take photos, take video, and just be careful because old plastic can break. In order to access the needle bar adjustments for height and rotation, we're going to have to take off a couple screws. Almost always there's a screw or two near the needle bar surrounding a light. First adjustment. So the presser foot bar is on the left and the needle bar is on the right. There is an Allen key nut right there that sets the needle bar height. I'm taking it out of the way. You don't really have to all the time, but there are circumstances where you might want to. Once the thing is loose or completely out, you can move the needle bar up and down. It's totally disconnected from the rest of the machine. That's needle bar height right there. That would be needle bar rotation. We're going to have to get both right. If you don't have a spec for the needle bar height, not really a big worry. You can just look for a set screw scar. That's a set screw scar. Basically, just center the scar in that circle and put the set screw back on. It's pretty obvious when you look for it. The other thing to keep in mind is that the needle bar box where the needles are being held should not be hitting the plastic at the top of the needle bar swing, and it should not be hitting the presser foot when it's raised at the bottom of the needle bar swing. It's a pretty narrow range of needle bar heights that don't hit the plastic and don't hit the presser foot. So you have a decent chance of guessing. If you do have a spec, then you're going to set it to the spec. So in order to prepare setting needle bar height, you're going to want to make this area underneath the needles pretty much clear of anything that could get in your way. So take off the presser foot. Take the upper knife and just set it so that it's raised in the air. And then you're also going to want to remove the upper looper. Just take it off. We're going to put it back in later and make it perfect. So we don't need it for now. Just be careful. Don't bend it. We want the whole area clear. So the needle bar height is defined as the distance between the throat plate, which is this, and the needle point of the lowest needle. In this case, that's the right needle. When the needle bar is at its highest position. That can be a little confusing. All it means is that this guy right here is going to be as high as he goes on the needle bar, and you figure that out by literally just turning the hand wheel until that guy is as high as he goes. So you can see here, since the needle bar is disconnected, it's not moving. We want to turn the hand wheel until it is at the absolute highest it goes, which looks to be right there. Okay, so when it's at its highest, you have to understand too that the feed dogs are going to be up. So that stuff's up. That's at least a millimeter. It's usually a millimeter to 2 millimeters high. So if you try and put something on the throw plate, there's a good chance that if it's very big, the feed dogs are going to make it higher than it should be. So you need something that is probably metal, that's not going to deform, that's small, that you can stack a bunch of in tiny increments, that you can put right underneath the needles. And I'm just going to suggest humbly to use coins. So the spec I'm doing for this is just a guess based on some stuff because I couldn't find an exact service manual, is going to be 9.8 millimeters. If you look at that, it looks like it's more than 9, less than 10. I don't think it's 9.8 though. Okay. So we have some options. We could just call it good. It's close-ish. Or we could add a little bit of thickness on the top. I don't think a coin is going to work. And that's why it's so useful to have these feeler gauges that are exact thicknesses. So I'm adding a 1/5 of a millimeter here, and it was almost impossible to get this shot. So you're just going to have to trust me. It looks like it's decently close now. So I think I'm just going to use this for the measurement. I'm just going to pretend this is 9.8 millimeters high. It may not be, but I also wanted to show that you don't have to be exact and the thing will probably still throw out an overlock. So if you really know the spec and you want to be exact, just use a digital caliper and then just add sheafs of feeler gauges to achieve exactly the measurement you want. I'm just going to time it like this. It's supposed to be 9.8, I think, and I'm just going to time it on this 9.54 thing. I don't think it necessarily has to be amazingly perfectly accurate. It would be nice. It would probably run better, but I think it'll still give us an overlock stitch, even if it's 0.26 off. Looking at this top down, you want, if you drew a line between the two needles, that line to be exactly parallel to the lower looper. Now, that's almost impossible to do by eye. So what we're going to do instead is we're just going to have this over-rotated counterclockwise, like 10 degrees. We're going to time the lower looper to the right needle, and then after that's timed right, we'll just rotate it back clockwise and make the left needle lower looper clearance perfect. So you're just going to wiggle this thing down until it just touches the metal, right? Touches the top of this width below it that is 9.8 millimeters high in theory. My needle bar is sort of sticky, so it's kind of tedious to do this, but note that I am leaving the needle bar very slightly over-rotated in the counterclockwise direction. This is a little exaggerated for the camera, but maybe like 5 or 10 degrees over-rotated. We're going to rotate it back clockwise later. We have the needle bar height, so now we're going to time the lower looper. So take the throw plate off. Here are the lower looper adjustments. You can see all the adjustment areas for the lower looper right here. So the height of the lower looper itself can be adjusted by that screw. The actual lower looper arm, the timing between the lower looper and the needle can be adjusted with that screw. The lower looper cam phase can be adjusted with this guy. There's 2 set screws. There's 1, there's 2. I'll start with the height of the lower looper. Super easy to adjust. It's usually spec'd out as the distance between this screw here on the end of the lower looper axle and the lower looper point. You can measure this distance by just using a string carefully and then setting it on a ruler, but I don't have a spec and I'm not going to do that. Instead, I am concerned with whether or not the lower looper is hitting the bottom of the feed dogs. That is my only concern here. There's probably 0.5 millimeter or 1 millimeter of clearance there. I have no clue what the actual spec is. I would want personally at least 0.5 millimeter, but probably more like 1 millimeter of clearance between the two. Additionally, if your cam phase, which I'll explain in a second, is really out, then you're probably going to have to fix the cam phase first because the feed dogs are moving up and down too. So you could easily have the feed dogs moving out of sync and then hitting the lower looper, even though the lower looper height is correct. Obviously, in order to alter the lower looper height, you're just dealing with this screw, moving it up and then putting it back in. Pretty easy. Okay, cam phase. The lower looper cam phase, a very easy thing to see once you understand it and to fix, but otherwise hopelessly confusing because nobody talks about it. When you turn the hand wheel, it moves this big shaft in the middle. And when those two set screws on this little ring are tight, that connects the entire lower looper assembly to the main crankshaft, right? So as I turn the hand wheel, if you zoom in, you can notice that this little axle that the lower looper is on, the axle is literally rotating. Okay, it's oscillating, I guess, but. So right now the lower looper is connected to the drive shaft. Now, if I loosen both these set screws and then I just hold this in place while turning the hand wheel, you'll notice that that little shaft is not moving at all. Everything, in fact, is moving except the lower looper. So the lower looper is now completely disconnected from the rest of the machine. Everything will move except the lower looper. That axle is not oscillating. Here's an example of great lower looper cam timing. The idea is that when the lower looper is all the way to the left, the needles are all the way down. That's it. Here's a bad cam phase. So when the lower looper is as far left as it goes, the needles are high, right? They're nowhere near their lowest. They're opposite. And when the needles are all the way at the bottom, the lower looper is not at its furthest leftmost position. It is somewhere way out right. So again, just looking at this, it's like a super easy thing to, at a glance to tell, oh, the cam phase is super out of whack. So here the cam phase is trash and we need to reset it. But you could always just find set screw scars on the lower looper cam phase and call that good. When you retighten these set screws, also make sure that this ring is not all the way out right. If it is, it'll rub on the aluminum housing a bit when you turn the crankshaft, which is definitely not great. Resetting the lower looper cam phase by sight is pretty easy to do, though. First, you're going to rotate that hand wheel until the lower looper is as far left as it goes. That looks good. Next, you're going to make sure that screw that's right there is really tight. You're going to loosen the other set screw. And then you're going to move it back to the furthest left position, moving the lower looper back to the furthest left position it goes. Now you're going to loosen the screw that you just tightened, but once you loosen it, you're just going to make sure to keep this Allen bar exactly still. Okay, don't move it up or down. Keep it right there. And then you're just going to turn the hand wheel until the needles go as far down as they can. So right about there. And then you're going to immediately tighten that set screw back. Make sure that you're not tightening it all the way in the right like I just did. That would be a mistake. Tighten the other set screw. Okay, when you turn the hand wheel, it should now be the case that the leftmost swing of the lower looper is simultaneous with the lowest swing of the needles. Let's talk about needles. So here are two needles. Those are the eyes of the needles. Right above them, there's a scalloped section. That's the scarf. On this top needle, I've used a Sharpie to mark the top of the scarf, okay? The scarf starts right above the eye, and it ends at that bottom of the black Sharpie section. Basically, the idea is that the lower looper point is going to need to intersect the needle somewhere in the scarf, okay? If it's not intersecting the needle in that scarf zone, there's really no chance whatsoever that the lower looper is going to pick up the needle threads. Here's a real close-up, nice and potato-like, of the scarf of a needle. I have thread through the eye. The thread is tensioned. You can see how there's this little space between the needle and the thread. The idea is that the lower looper point is hitting into that space. And once it gets into that space, it has totally captured the needle thread. Now, of course, this is happening at the same time that the needle is pulling up slightly, and so you have a loop in the thread. So the actual space between the needle and the loop is much larger than this, but just to show you the scarf. And just one more time, here's the kind of Speedy Stitcher example of you have a threaded needle, and as soon as it pulls back, a loop is created in the thread. Okay, just be aware of that happening all the time. It's important to understand how the needle is attempting to manipulate the thread. So there's two adjustments to be made here, but they're really done in one. First of all, you're making sure that the lower looper point is hitting at the right part of the scarf zone. And secondly, you're making sure the clearance between the lower looper point and the needle is correct. So this boy can go left and right, front and back. It helps to oil the axle that it's on. It really does. If there's a bunch of gunk on it, it's going to be really hard to make minute adjustments because it'll just move from stuck part to stuck part. So we're going to bring the needles down all the way to the bottom and then bring them up so they're rising. And you want the lower looper point to just barely be on the right side of the right needle. We're timing with this right needle. So notice this. Right here, I have the lower looper point at the kind of 0% of the scarf zone on the bottom. Now I have it in the middle of the scarf zone right there. And then that would be the top of the scarf zone. So the manuals always have specs, but if you don't have a manual, where to put it? I would suggest putting it about 25 or 30% up the scarf zone. So right about there is looking good to me. Sometimes it can be a little lower, sometimes it can be a little higher. If you really are having troubles with it catching, you can just experiment, but something like 25% is a good, safe first attempt. So that would be perfect. So let's call this position right here where the lower looper point is tangent on that right side of the right needle. Let's call that the timing position. In order to set the clearance between the lower looper and the right needle, you're going to start in the timing position, loosen the lower looper arm set screw, move the lower looper back and forth until the clearance is correct, and then tighten it in the timing position. If you don't tighten it back into the timing position, then you will have messed up the timing, right? So the idea is you want to change the clearance while keeping the timing you just set the same. So we have the left-right clearance correct, but that's kind of trivial. We have to get the front-back clearance correct. So this is really subtle. So I must have this on repeat. Let me try and explain. The lower looper point, because it's hitting at the 25% part of the scarf zone, right? It's going to end up kind of bumping the eye of the needle on the bottom there. And so you're going to see a bump where it hits the eye of the needle, right? A little bit. That's not a problem. The problem is that when you look closely at this, before it even hits that bottom bump, it's actually hitting the needle. If you look right in between the two needles, there's a dark area and you can see it change because it's actually hitting the right needle and not properly spaced. So we're going to have to try again. Here, the lower looper point is too far from the needle. And I would still call that too far. We want it to be a 20th of a millimeter. Boop, hitting right there. So it's too close. Could be just very tedious. Try number 6,000. So this one, I believe, is finally good. Yeah, so it almost looks like it's two separate bumps, but it's just hitting the far left part of that eye of the thing. So really, really check. I mean, this takes a while. Eventually you get better at this. It really helps to have the lower looper axle oiled though. I'm just going to reiterate that. Just remember, each one of these little markings is a 0.5 millimeter, and the clearance that you're looking for between the lower looper point and the needle is a 20th of a millimeter. So a 10th of one of these little notches, 1/10 is how close they're supposed to be at maximum. Possibly, though, it could go to 0 as long as they don't actually touch. Okay, what really happens in practice is that they're going to imperceptibly touch, but it's not enough of a bump to even see. Now let's fix that needle bar rotation. We have the lower looper and the right needle perfectly timed now, okay? The clearance between them is like the 20th or 30th of a millimeter. But goodness gracious, the clearance between the left needle is not particularly good. So let's fix that. If you're super lucky, your Serger will look like this. This little box beneath the set screw we saw earlier allows you to simply do the needle bar rotation independent of the needle bar height, okay? And the way that works is you have the height set with that box, and you can just turn it whatever way you want, deal with the rotation, and then you just snug the screw like you did before, and the height stays the same. Unfortunately, we do not have that because this is an older Serger, so you just have to be very careful to not mess up the height. Unfortunately, my Serger's a little older, so I don't have the needle bar rotation block. So the way to do this instead is going to be take the lower looper point and align it with the right side of the left needle. And then remember this. So it looks like it's about 30 or 40% up the scarf on the left needle. If the needle bar gets too loose and just drops down, it's going to obviously have messed up the entire needle bar height. Luckily, if you just remember where on the needle the lower looper was intersecting, you can just push the needle bar back up until it's at the right height and then snug it a bit more so that it can rotate, but it can't fall. So with the worst case scenario being insured against, we can now just test the clearance between the left needle and the lower looper with a flathead, and it's just going to be rotating the needle bar clockwise a little bit, testing, rotating clockwise a little bit, testing, just sort of over and over again. The idea would be that if the needle bar rotation is too clockwise, then the left needle is not going to capture the upper looper thread. But if it's too counterclockwise, the lower looper is not going to capture the left needle thread. So you want the clearance between the lower looper and the left needle to be pretty good. It probably won't be as tight as the clearance between the lower looper and the right needle. But the most important thing is that after you think you have the clearance good, look at the needle bar box that the needles are in and make sure that it looks like it's pretty much directly straight towards you, right? This one, I messed up a tiny bit, as you'll see later, and it's a little too rotated clockwise. So look, after the rotation has been set, check it again, make sure it's hitting the scarf zone at the right points, and then look at it from the side and make sure that the needles are not being bumped by the lower looper. Should be perfect at this point, though. So here's the upper looper. We're going to put him in. It can be a little tricky to slide him in, so you might need to turn the hand wheel a bit to find the right angle. The most important part of installing this upper looper from the very beginning is to make sure that it is in all the way. So push it all the way in. And then just snug it. You want to make it sure it's not going to hit the needles and it's not going to hit the lower looper, but this is like a super general adjustment right now. I would probably just push it so that it hits the needles and then rotate it a little bit away from the needles and tighten it. Super lax. We're just making sure we can move the hand wheel and not break stuff while we actually time it. When the upper looper is as far left as it will swing, how far left is the upper looper point from the left side of the left needle? Well, let's measure. This one says about 3 millimeters. So usually the spec is between 3 and 4. I think for this it's 3.5-ish, something like that. Again, I'm just guessing. I think I'm going to do like 3.6, 3.7. So we're just going to loosen that screw like so. Going to push that up just a tad. And then cinch it back. And you're doing all this, right, after rotating the hand wheel so that the upper looper is in its leftmost position. So let's look at it now. In terms of the leftmost position, it is, I apologize for the blur, it's like 3.5-ish now. Okay, I'm going to call that good. This is just a top-down view of the upper looper and the lower looper to show you that there is a sort of clearance between them that has to be set. We're not going to do it yet, but just check this really quick to make sure that when you rotate the hand wheel, the upper looper isn't going to hit the lower looper. This looks fun. And we're back looking at this area again. We had that lower looper cam phase ring right there. We also have an upper looper cam phase, and that would be right there. It also has 2 set screws. They take a slightly smaller Allen key. We're going to basically loosen both these guys, and that'll let us move the upper looper around a little bit so that it has a good timing with relation to the lower looper. So you're going to loosen both of them. And what I usually do is I take the top one, move it a little bit, and I put that Allen key like that in there, and then I switch this boy around like this. Okay. Now we're in a good position to do this. So just remember that if you mess up the adjustments here, the upper looper is going to hit the lower looper or vice versa. And they'll probably damage each other quite a lot because they're both pretty hardened metal. The needles break easily. I've had my needles hit my upper looper a couple times and shatter, and the thing's fine, whatever. Unfortunate, but that was when I was learning. So what you're going to want to do is adjust it so that this upper looper has a little bit of clearance with respect to that lower looper bulb. Okay, so the upper looper going up and down is me turning the little Allen key in that upper looper cam phase adjustment. And I'm going to tighten the nuts here in a second, but check this out. The upper looper is supposed to be kind of going diagonal here, parallel to the lower looper's little diagonal line there, but there's supposed to be some clearance. I think it's 0.5 millimeter as a spec. I don't know. You could do a millimeter. It's not going to probably kill it. As long as it picks up the lower looper thread, you're pretty good. This is an easy thing to do. So I've put the set screws in now, and that's looking pretty good to me, right? About 0.5 millimeter between them. So I'm going to now deal with the clearance front back. Okay, so now we're going to figure out this upper looper, lower looper, front back clearance. This isn't really good. We want it to be 1/3 of a millimeter-ish. So let's change it. Okay, that's pretty good. Realistically, you can experiment a little bit with this. You could have the entire machine together and still adjust this because it's just a single Allen key. If you look close, they are not hitting, and the reflection of the upper looper in the lower looper, I think, helps to show just how kind of close they are. Yeah, so I was going to put this little upper looper thread guide on. It looks like it's kind of bent. So I'm just going to take it off and bend it and put it back on. Yeah, it looks better now. If that thing's not in good condition, you can't really put a 2-thread converter on top. Oops, I forgot about this, but this thread guide here should be very roughly parallel to this arm here. There's an actual spec. I'm not sure how much it matters. I'm really only throwing it in because maybe it's catastrophically off and that could be causing problems, but very roughly parallel. So before you put this back together, just ask yourself a couple questions, right? Are all the screws tight? Okay, and when you turn the hand wheel, really turn it slowly and feel, is there anything hitting or bumping? Because if you forget to snug a certain nut one way or move something back a couple inches, you can end up destroying these things. So just be careful. Okay, so we're putting it back together, yada, yada, yada. It was kind of tedious. I kept dropping the screws and all that kind of stuff. So realistically, if you take it to a service center, they'll have the actual specs, which helps quite a lot to time it correctly. But if it's kind of an old cheap machine and it's only worth $100, why spend the value of the machine and getting it timed? I mean, it is a nice thing to have it perfectly in time, but if you can do it for free and get it good enough, why not do that? So let's test it. All right, so it's all put together. I have it running off of a spool holder on the other one. I showed for perfect timing because I don't have any spool holders for this guy yet. They're in the mail. So I'm hand cranking it. It looks like it's not hitting anything, feels fine. Threads are catching, cool. All right, let's run it. This motor is in mediocre condition, but it does still work. At high speeds, it kind of gets rattly, but okay, and goodness gracious, that does not look quite good. So let's look at it. What's wrong? Well, this is intriguing. You can see that the left needle thread is in there, but it's not catching the white every time, which is the upper looper thread. So that tells me, since the bottom looks perfect, that either the upper looper is not going far left enough, or the needle bar rotation is off a little bit. It would be too far clockwise, right? In which case the left needle would not be grabbing that upper looper thread. So that's fine, no big deal. Let's look at the thing, just slow-mo. So I think the issue is the needle bar rotation. I think I was a little lazy with it. You can see that that left needle there should be going down between the white thread and the upper looper, but instead it's on the outside of the white thread. Yeah. So since that upper looper, I think, is far enough left, I don't think there's any danger of that upper looper being too right to not give the left needle a chance to grab it. It must probably be the needle bar rotation a little too clockwise. Now I'm looking at it from up above here. This is the best I can get on film, and it looks like the left needle is a little bit further back from the upper looper than the right needle. So, oops. Let's take it apart and very quickly rotate the needle bar like 2 degrees counterclockwise. Okay, so I did that. It was very tedious, and I'm not going to show you any film from it. And now it looks like it's quite good. It's grabbing it. Yep. It was not a problem of the leftmost position of the upper looper, because all I changed was the rotation a little bit, and now it's hitting real well. So that was just my bad. Let's try it once more. To reiterate, we set the needle bar height not exactly. We set the lower looper needle timings off of just a YOLO 25% up the scarf zone idea, and I did not use any sort of serious measurements with the upper looper, lower looper timings, besides just keeping them close but not hitting. And what we get is a perfect overlock stitch. So that tells me you don't need the specs to retime a serger, although of course having the specs would be mighty nice and preferable if you can find them. Okay. But it's not that hard.
Sergers are great, sergers are cool. Sergers can make you look like a fool, but they're just a tool. So welcome to school. I hope you liked my vid.